Well, hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to this CSG eCademy webinar on the states to watch on transportation funding in 2017. This is the 5th year in a row that we've done this webinar, and we thank you all for joining us. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Here's what we have planned for the next hour. First, we're going to get a national perspective on state transportation funding, and for that, we'll turn to Dr. Alison Black, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association in Washington, D.C. Dr. Black and ARTBA run a website called the Transportation Investment Advocacy Center, which is a great repository of case studies on state transportation funding. She's going to talk about the national landscape of state transportation funding efforts in 2017 and some of the common themes and trends we've seen in recent years around the country. Then we're going to get reports on 4 key states that are seeing significant activity on transportation funding this year. We'll hear about what's going on in Indiana from Caitlin Lang of the Evansville Courier and Press. We'll go out to New Mexico and talk with Andy Lyman of the New Mexico Political Report. We'll hear from Gordon Friedman of the Oregonian newspaper about what might happen in Salem this year. And I'll have a few words to say about Tennessee as well. If at any point during the webinar you have a question or comment for one of our presenters, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar on your computer screen, and we will ask as many as time allows during the course of or at the end of the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Alison Primo Black from the American Road and Transportation Builders Association joins us. Alison, what are we seeing this year, and what have we seen in recent years on the state transportation funding front?
There's been a lot of activity, and thank you for the invitation again to be a part of your webinar. I'm very pleased to be here. So I want to give you just a brief overview of some of the trends and things that we've been seeing at the state and local level. And you'll see on the next slide is the information on our Transportation Investment Advocacy Center. I would encourage you all, please take a look at the website. We have a lot of great case studies, background information, basically everything that transportation advocates need to know so they're not reinventing the wheel. So that's a free resource, and I hope you will take advantage of that. So on the next slide, you'll see I want to talk for just a very brief moment about the federal aid highway program. Even though I know we're talking about state and local investment, I think one of the key drivers for all the activity we have seen over the last 3 to 4 years with the increases in state gas taxes and other revenue sources is in part because of some of the uncertainty that's been going on with the federal aid highway program. So what you're looking at is a map of the relationship between federal aid reimbursements to state DOTs, which by law, most of this money is spent on capital outlays, which is going to be construction, right-of-way, and engineering. So it's the ratio of those federal reimbursements to what state DOTs are spending in their programs on capital outlay. So you can see that it really does vary from state to state, but the national average is about 51%. So what this means is about half of all highway and bridge construction and capital activity is from the federal aid program. So a couple of things have happened the last few years. You certainly have a number of states where their own gas tax rates have not changed in a number of years, and in many cases for decades. You have a lot of pent-up demand after the recession and a big drop in highway work after 2008. And then you have the uncertainty over the federal aid program as Congress has passed a series of short-term extensions. MAP 21 was a funding bill that was only 2 years. So states really haven't had the certainty for a large chunk of their program. And on the next slide, you'll see that even though we do have a federal bill that was passed, a 5-year bill, the FAST Act, it really is not providing significant resources to grow the highway and bridge construction market. When you look at project costs or just general inflation, the money in the FAST Act, those nominal obligation levels, what states are using that's driving about half their program, is not going to be providing significant real growth. So it really comes down to state and local governments to provide some of that funding, excuse me, and to provide that real growth. So on the next slide, you'll see a map of where, excuse me, fighting a cold, I think, like many folks out there. In January 2017, we saw 9 states introduce 22 transportation funding bills. And actually, I just checked this morning with what we've been collecting, and within this week, we're now up to 33 bills in 15 states. So there is quite a bit of activity. I think we're going to see a lot happening this year. Again, we've had really unprecedented levels in terms of just looking at gas tax increases the last 3 to 4 years. In terms of the type of legislation we're seeing introduced this year, 17 of the bills include some sort of gas tax increase. We do have 1 lockbox measure that's been introduced, 3 bills that are related to just one-time funding. We do have 5 bills that include non-fuel reoccurring funding, and that is a trend that we've seen where you do have user fees, things related to highway users, but not necessarily a gas tax and recurring revenues. We do have 5 bills that have been introduced which are allowing local governments to raise their own revenues, so that's another trend, trying to give local governments some more flexibility. In terms of the political parties that are sponsoring these bills, the legislators that have put them forth, 18 of the bills are from Republican legislators, 11 are from Democrats, we have 1 independent, and 3 have been introduced by bipartisan measures. So quite a bit of activity. This is on pace with what we have seen, what we saw in 2015 actually. And this is from our most recent, I see the slide says January 2016, but it's actually 2017, our most recent report, which is on the website. You can find all the details of each of those bills. And moving on to the next slide, you'll see what we tracked for 2016. We actually had 93 bills, you can see, covering most of the country that were introduced. A lot of these bills end up dying in committee. They don't always get to the floor for a full vote in the legislature, but I think it shows you pretty much the span. Almost every state is trying to at least introduce some sort of transportation funding legislation. Now, the bills we tracked, this was quite a bit lower than what we saw in 2015, but that is not surprising. For many, of course, it was an election year. That has an impact on what's being introduced. And then it was also a shorter cycle for many legislatures. They allow their folks more time to campaign, so they're not in office as often as they are in a non-election year for many state legislative houses. So the next slide just gives you an idea of the breakdown of what we saw in terms of funding measures last year. Again, gas tax increases, we're about 22%. That's a little bit lower. Usually the average over the last few years has been closer to 25%. But those are actually some of the it's still a very popular way to raise revenues. But as I mentioned, we are seeing quite a few bills related to other user fees. That other category is a very large catch-all. It might be studies looking at transportation funding or other funding mechanisms that don't quite fall into those other areas. On the next slide, you'll see we did have 1 state that passed a gas tax increase, of course, New Jersey, in the fall of 2016. And they really were in a position where they just absolutely had to get that done for their highway trust fund. So a few bills introduced across the country, but again, not as many as we've seen in years past, but not surprising given it was an election year. The next slide just shows 2 other, I just picked a few of the categories we track, but we did have 2 states, Illinois and New Jersey, pass the legislative language to get a lockbox on the ballot in 2016 statewide votes. So basically the lockbox, we tend to see this. It's some sort of language, usually a constitutional amendment that says that transportation revenues can only be spent for transportation purposes. And a lot of times we'll see this either before or after a gas tax increase is passed, and many times the voters like to see this if there's any question about revenues being diverted or a history of raiding a transportation trust fund to balance the budget or that type of activity. So we do see a handful of these each year. And then the next slide shows you what we did see quite a bit of last year. Those dark gray boxes are states that approved one-time funding measures. So this is not reoccurring revenue, but we did see bonds that were passed in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and South Carolina. And then the other states were one-time general fund transfers, and those were in Indiana, Nebraska, Arizona, Missouri, and Arkansas. So it's very common if a state has a surplus in their general fund that sometimes they will pass measures to put a portion of that, those proceeds towards transportation investment. So again, not a reoccurring revenue source, but certainly a one-time increase. I don't have this pulled out in a map, but we did have two states, Rhode Island and Vermont, that did pass other user-related fees. So Rhode Island passed a commercial truck toll, which is going to be used for bonding for their bridge program, and then Vermont increased some of their fees and fines as well. So the next slide will give you just a quick summary of where we have seen gas tax increases. Again, still one of the primary ways to fund state transportation programs, although the user fees, license fees, those other user-related reoccurring revenues are probably at this point just about bringing in as much on average as most state gas taxes. So, but we have seen quite a bit of activity. The states in yellow have approved a gas tax increase just over the 2013 to 2016 period, and again, 8 of those states were in 2015 alone. So quite a bit of activity, and again, I think that reflects what I was talking about at the beginning. We've seen a lot of pent-up demand. Many of these states have not raised their user fees in decades. And then the uncertainty over the federal program, I think, is also driving states to really increase their own revenues, because if they're really going to grow their program to meet their needs, it's not coming from the federal aid side. So again, we definitely expect to see some activity over the next year. This is really a large number of increases in gas tax rates. Usually we see them clustered maybe about 3 to 5 states, usually around the time that a federal bill is passed, but we were long overdue. We hadn't seen a gas tax increase since 2008 before the recession. So I think that's what we're seeing. There's also the momentum that as states start to do this, you see more folks taking action. The next slide will show you just some of the research we do at the center at TIAC. One thing that is true is transportation investment at the state level is still a bipartisan issue, and it's really been Republican governors and legislatures that have been leading the charge over the last few years to raise their gas tax rates. And of course in New Jersey, Governor Chris Christie is a Republican. Both houses of their legislature are majority Democrat. Of the 8 gas tax increases that passed in 2015, you had Michigan, Utah, South Dakota, Idaho, and Georgia, where there was, again, a governor and a House and Senate that were all majority Republican. So, sometimes there's a myth out there that you have to be of one political party or another to raise transportation resources or raise the gas tax, and that certainly doesn't bear true when you really look at the spectrum and who's making these decisions at the state level. And then the next slide will just show you another piece of research that we do. The last few elections, we've looked at all of the legislators that vote on a gas tax increase and then see how they do in the general election. Again, because sometimes we hear folks say, well, I can't vote for a gas tax increase because I will just be kicked out of office. And while it is true that in some districts and some states there is definitely some dialogue and quite some discussion about gas tax votes, overall there really is not a huge difference between the folks that vote yes or no on a gas tax increase and how they do. And what you're looking at here is some analysis we did with the primaries, because we thought, well, if you're really going to be challenged on the gas tax, it might be coming in a primary rather than a general election. And overall, on average, any legislator who voted for a gas tax increase in 2015, 98% of those folks who voted yes won their primary reelection, and 97% of those who voted no won their primary reelection of those states, again, in 2015 that passed those increases. So, and those are consistent with what we've seen in both the 2014 and 2016 general election as well. So my last slide is just another trend to highlight is really the local spending piece with some of the ballot initiatives that we saw on November 8th. We tracked, let's see, I don't think I wrote down the number in front of me, but it was about 360 ballot initiatives from state and local governments throughout the entire year, the primaries and the November 8th election in 2016. And this was a significant increase from what we've seen in years past. And you start to see when you add up what was approved and you look at it on a map, you can really start to see pockets of regions and in states in the U.S. where local governments are going to be investing significant resources over the next few years. And again, Texas, a lot of that's nearly $1 billion, much of it concentrated in the Austin area. Quite a bit of Georgia will be in the Atlanta area. So this just goes to show you that local governments are doing their part as well. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And just a reminder to folks, if you have a question for Allison or any of our presenters, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar, and we will collect those here in Lexington and ask as many as time allows. And we did get one question in, and it concerns the slide about the states, that 93 transportation funding bills were introduced in 2016. And they're asking what the colors mean on the map and whether the light blue means that those states had no bills or fewer bills, or what the color coding is there they're asking about.
Sure. The excuse me. The light blue is actually a neutral, so there was not any sort of bill introduced that was related to transportation funding. Okay, great.
Well, I want to turn now to highlight the first of 4 states that are high on the list of states to watch this year, and that is Indiana. And joining us on the phone is Caitlin Lang, statehouse reporter for the Evansville Courier and Press. Caitlin, what can you tell us about what's going on in Indianapolis this session on the transportation funding front?
Yeah, guys, thanks for letting me be here today. Very excited to talk on this topic I've been covering. Basically, the state is trying to raise an estimated $1.2 billion each year to fix existing roads and to work on building new roads throughout the state. So most lawmakers on all sides are in support of funding road legislation in some capacity. Right now it's just a matter of how to do that. House lawmakers are leading the charge for the most part in creating a bill that would do this, and their plan has a number of facets. First of all, it would increase the gas tax 10 cents. Right now the gas tax is at 18 cents, special fuel is at 16, and the motor carrier surcharge is at 11. So all of those would go up 10 cents in the first year, and then they would also go up with inflation each year as well, with a cap of 1 cent. So it won't go up more than 1 cent each year after this initial first year. The other ways they're trying to raise that $1.2 billion, requiring a $15 yearly registration fee on all motor vehicles, and then a $150 registration fee for electric vehicles. They also, right now in Indiana, the gas sales tax, part of that goes to the general fund, so they are working on phasing that out over the next 4 years until all of that money goes directly to the roads in Indiana. So that would create about $360 million additional dollars just in the roads fund by doing that. So by 2021, if this bill passes, all money paid at the pumps will actually go to roads. So far, the governor of Indiana, Eric Holcomb, he has said that he supports a menu of options in raising this $1.2 billion, but he hasn't really specified what that means and what he wants. So really, it's just depending on this House bill to further clarify how they're going to get that money. There's been quite a bit of opposition, obviously, to the plan to raise 10 cents on the gas increase. The gas tax in Indiana hasn't raised since 2003, so this is a pretty big deal for a lot of these conservative groups. And then also the Indiana Petroleum Marketers and Convenience Store Association, they are sort of campaigning against this legislation right now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Another common complaint besides just the tax increase is that not all the money paid at the pumps goes towards roads right now, as I mentioned earlier. So although this bill would change that, it wouldn't be immediate, which some people have complained about. This change of phasing out the gas sales tax would leave a hole in the general budget, which lawmakers haven't really suggested any solutions yet to fix that. It could be potentially a cigarette tax in the future, but there will be a $360 million hole that will need to be fixed if this goes through. The other thing this bill requires is a study on toll roads in Indiana, which there aren't really, the only toll roads in Indiana right now are on some bridges, and then also in the northwest area of the state near Chicago. So this bill basically, while not requiring tolling to happen, it is definitely the first steps in Indiana getting these toll roads, and without having these toll roads, the state cannot get to having that estimated $1.2 billion per year that studies show the state needs in order to maintain and build more roads. So it'll be interesting to see if in the next 4 years or so the lawmakers are back asking for toll roads as an additional way to raise money throughout the state. And I know there is some discussion on that, whether there would be existing roads tolled or if it's just going to be new roads. So that will be another huge debate later on. The only other plan kind of opposing this one right now is one proposed by the Democrats actually a couple days ago on Monday here. They proposed a plan that relies on freezing corporate tax cuts and then also reducing the budget surplus in the state, and then it also relies on finding $300 million in waste in the budget each year. So there are some unknowns with their proposal, and again, they just presented it this week, so it's not in a formal bill form, and Republicans didn't really respond too well about the plan. They criticized it for not focusing on the long term enough, so I'm not sure how much of that will make it into the actual budget. Yeah, this year, I know Alison mentioned some of this, but it's a huge change from previous years. Last year, House Republicans tried presenting legislation that would call for a 4-cent gas tax increase and then also a $1 cigarette tax increase in an attempt to raise road money. But that ended up not going through the Senate, and then also former Governor and now Vice President Mike Pence didn't really support the legislation, so they settled for that short-term funding. So this is a pretty bold move for a state that has prided itself on cutting taxes like they've done over the past few years, and again hasn't implemented a gas tax since 2003.
Okay, great. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you as well. And if you have a question for Caitlin, please type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar on your computer screen, and we'll ask those questions as we receive them. Now we want to go out to New Mexico and bring in Andy Lyman. He's a reporter for the New Mexico Political Report. Andy, what kinds of conversations are you hearing in Santa Fe this year about transportation funding?
Yeah, it's historically the same conversations we've had for a while. Right now, the gas tax increase has been a conversation for a while, as we haven't raised our state gas taxes for about 20 years. So it's been at 17 cents a gallon for a while now. Excuse me. And right now, there's a handful of proposals out there related to gas taxes. A couple of the big ones would increase it by 10 cents with an index, so it would, stop it at a certain point. There was recently a poll done, an independent poll here in New Mexico, that showed voters are okay with gas tax increases, but they were not as popular as increasing, say, alcohol and tobacco, or just raising income tax, or gross receipt taxes on internet sales. Of course, those things wouldn't go to roads necessarily. We've also had the similar issue as other states, is that, well, we are in what many people are calling a budget crisis here. So, excuse me, our governor doesn't want to raise any taxes. She's campaigned twice and been very adamant that she does not want to raise any taxes. And she is opposed to a gas tax increase. She wants to rely on capital outlay funding for those roads. There's another proposal out there right now that would allow local governments and municipalities to implement a gas tax, or actually put it on the ballot. So they couldn't raise it; they'd have to put it to voters within those communities. That proposal would cap it at about 5 cents. And some people have a problem with that because the smaller communities here in New Mexico don't necessarily have a mechanism to collect more taxes. It might cost them money to collect those taxes. There has been a few conversations about, diversifying some of that stuff, and as far as tolls go, but I don't see that we don't have any toll roads here in New Mexico, and I don't think that would be a very popular thing. We're kind of a unique state in that we're pretty happy about the way that we don't have to pay for certain things through tolls and that kind of thing. As far as gas taxes go, for some of the free market folks, more libertarian leaning here in New Mexico, they don't have a problem per se with the gas tax increase, but of course they do have an issue with how the roads are funded, or how much it costs to fix roads. Of course, we have what we refer to as a Little Davis-Bacon Act, and so some of those right-leaning libertarian type folks are saying, let's look at how much it costs to repair roads before we start increasing taxes. But ultimately, they're okay with this user fee of a gas tax. But ultimately, we're looking at one of the sponsors for the bill that would raise it by 10 cents. He estimates that it would raise about $140 million in the first year. His proposal also says half of it would go to reserves and half of it would go to the roads. Once we got the reserves up to where we wanted it, then it would all go to roads. But again, we're kind of stuck here with generally it's the Democrats that are saying we should raise gas taxes and not cut as much. Our Republican governor is saying let's cut, we don't need to raise taxes. So I don't see it, even if it gets through the legislature. I would be very, very surprised if the governor signs a gas tax increase unless it's in some sort of larger legislation that she likes. But ultimately, we are in a kind of a budget crisis here in New Mexico, and the governor keeps saying that she wants to cut instead of raise. A lawmaker recently said, if we cut any more, we're not cutting, we're amputating. So it'll be interesting to see how things go this session. Maybe the more popular one would be this allowing local governments to go ahead and put it on the ballot to raise gas taxes. But that's pretty much where we are right now.
Okay, Andy, thank you so much. And if you have a question for Andy or any speaker this afternoon, you can let us know by typing it into the GoToWebinar interface. Next, we're going to head out to Oregon and bring in Gordon Friedman. He's a Statehouse reporter for the Oregonian newspaper. Gordon, what can you tell us about discussions in Salem on transportation funding this year?
Yeah, so thanks for having me to the webinar to speak to all of you. Transportation is one of the big issues in the legislature this year. Basically, Oregon's roads and bridges and culverts are crumbling. They have been for quite some time, and lawmakers are trying to figure out what they can do to fund some necessary upgrades. Also posing a problem is earthquake preparedness. We're expecting a major earthquake event, potentially a 9.0 earthquake in the next 50 years, and most of our roads and bridges would be severely damaged in the event of an earthquake that large. We also have a large section of coast, and some of our coastal roads could be damaged or destroyed in a tsunami. So we need to have adequate, basically, evacuation routes and egress routes. So the legislature last year formed a special bipartisan committee with members from the House and Senate, and the committee toured the state all summer, basically holding town halls to hear from, Jane Q. public and often lobbyists who would attend the meetings about what they want to see out of a transportation package. We also have the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is the oversight body of the Oregon Department of Transportation. And the Transportation Commission has given the legislature their vision for what a good package would look like. The governor also convened a panel, and they gave lawmakers their feedback. So right now, we don't have a bill that is drafted yet, and we're not expecting a bill to be available until March or April. But generally, lawmakers are looking for about $1 billion a year in new revenue. And given that Oregon is a small state, we only have 4 million people that live here, it's kind of a heavy lift for lawmakers, for taxpayers, for interest groups. And so they're looking for lots of new revenue. They're not really sure exactly where it's going to come from. They're definitely thinking an increase, a gas tax increase. But the politicians are on this joint committee are also exploring some more controversial proposals. Tolling has kind of been a third rail in Oregon politics, but they're actually thinking about which roads they could, which projects they could toll. They're thinking about, per mile taxes or fees. They're thinking about changing. We have a weight mile tax, potentially even a tax or a fee associated with purchases of bicycle parts or bicycle tires, other types of fees. And the politics of the plan is kind of interesting because although Oregon is a Democratic state with a Democratic governor and Democratic legislature, Democrats do not have the 3/5 majority that they need to pass tax increases unilaterally, and so they will need votes from Republicans. They'll need to make concessions, and the main thing that Republicans are signaling they want so far is to repeal the state's low-carbon fuel standard, which basically requires that certain amounts of ethanol be blended into fuel sold in the state. Democrats are kind of keeping their cards close to the vest at this point, not saying where they'll cave or how. And another interesting thing to note is that we're not really sure whether this bill that comes out of this committee will include a list of projects and a dollar amount attached to those projects, or if it will just include revenue plans, and then it'll say, you know, ODOT and the Transportation Commission should just come up with, you know, they know which projects they need to fund, and, you know, we just give them more money. So another thing that has been going on is an audit of the Department of Transportation. Lawmakers tried and failed to pass a transportation plan in 2015, and some lawmakers blamed that on bad information coming from ODOT in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, other scientific data, and so the governor called for an audit of the department. It's taken, you know, almost 2 years to do the audit, and it's cost the state more than $1 million. But basically, it came back last week giving ODOT a relatively clean bill of health, but also saying that the agency could do a better job with procurement, making sure that it spends its money, you know, really paving and repaving roads and doing seismic retrofitting. And that audit and the health of ODOT is a big issue for lawmakers, because if they're going to, you know, give the department another $1 billion a year for 20 years, and they're looking at a 20-year plan, you know, they want to be sure that those dollars will be handled properly. Another thing that's interesting is that it's really easy to get things on the ballot in Oregon, or it's relatively easy compared to with other states. And so lobbying groups, interest groups are basically going to legislators on this Joint Transportation Committee, and even in committee hearings openly kind of saying, you know, this is our position. If you tax us this way, if you put a toll this way or a fee this way, you know, we will spend the money to get your bill on the ballot, because certain bills raising taxes can be easily referred to the ballot and need to be approved by voters. And so they're basically kind of threatening to put the bill on the ballot, and Oregon voters tend to reject gas tax increases and other tax increases. They on the November ballot, they rejected a tax increase overwhelmingly. So, and these interest groups are everyone from, you know, the Petroleum Association to the Truckers Association to environmental groups, bicycling groups, and so we may see this, whatever plan does get passed, if a plan passes, we may see it end up on the ballot, which is kind of lawmakers' worst nightmare, because they just want to take care of business in the Capitol and have everyone be happy here and avoid a fight that plays out on the ballot. The last thing I would note is that this push to find more money for transportation projects comes at a time when Oregon is facing a $2 billion budget deficit, and because the state must pass a balanced budget, we can't go into debt. There's going to have to be cuts and likely a mix of new revenues just to balance the budget in general. So asking for another $1 billion a year for transportation projects, it's kind of taking a back seat to just shoring up the budget in general, and we'll see how things play out. Some lawmakers are very happy with how things are going so far. Others are saying that it's, you know, kind of a 50-50 chance whether or not Oregon will actually be able to pass a transportation plan. Everyone has agreed that the state really needs it. The congestion in Portland is really bad, and Oregon is such a rural state in its southern and eastern parts that in the event of a major earthquake, those rural 2-lane highways are going to be the only way that people, freight, emergency services get in and out of Portland, Salem, and Eugene and other larger cities. So everyone agrees something needs to be done. They're just not sure how they're going to do it and where the political compromise will be made.
Great. Thank you, Gordon, as well. And you can send us a question for Gordon or one of our other speakers today by typing it into the GoToWebinar taskbar. I did want to say a few words about Tennessee, which is also a very important state to watch this year. We'd hoped to have a reporter on to hear about what's happening in Nashville, but unfortunately, all the folks we reached out to weren't available. But here's what we know. Tennessee has a $10 billion backlog of road projects awaiting funding. Governor Bill Haslam has been pushing for a 7-cent gas tax hike, a 12-cent diesel tax hike, and new fees on electric vehicles and rental cars. Electric vehicle owners would pay a $100 fee. The rental car charge would be 3%. Vehicle registration fees would also go up. His plan would index the gas tax to the consumer price index to account for inflation. The state's flat gas tax rate has not been raised in nearly 3 decades. Haslam's plan would provide $227 million to the Tennessee Department of Transportation, $78 million to counties, and $39 million to cities. The governor's plan also would allow municipalities to hold referenda to decide whether to impose a surcharge on sales tax rates to fund public transit projects. Haslam has been trying to sell the plan to lawmakers by suggesting tax cuts to offset the increases. They include cuts to the state's franchise and excise tax, the grocery tax rate, and the hall income tax, which is the tax on earnings from dividends and interest. And Haslam's plan now has some competition as well. Republican Representative David Hawk has offered his own proposal that wouldn't increase the gas tax, but it would take 1/4% of the state's 7% sales tax, and instead of having that money go into the general fund, it would go to the state DOT. His plan would generate about $33 million less for the DOT than Haslam's plan would, $13 million less for counties, and $6.5 million less for cities. Others are suggesting earmarking general fund dollars for infrastructure projects or tapping a more than $1 billion surplus that the state now has. There is reportedly some concern that too many rival funding proposals could wind up torpedoing the effort to find solutions this year in Tennessee. So that is some of what Tennessee is looking at. And some other states to note in passing, Alaska is evidently looking at a proposal to triple their lowest in the nation gas tax. House leaders in South Carolina are backing a 10-cent increase there. Like Indiana, Arizona, and Louisiana, both had special task forces in place in 2016 to come up with revenue options to consider in 2017. The chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in Arizona has proposed a 10-cent gas tax increase there. Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper has suggested asking voters to raise that state's sales tax rate, while Republican legislators want to transfer money from other areas of the budget. So now we have a few minutes for questions from our webinar audience, and you may still send us yours in that GoToWebinar taskbar on your computer screen, and we will ask as many as time allows. And while we're collating those questions and receiving those here in Lexington, I want to bring back in Alison Black from the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Alison, when you hear about the debates on transportation funding going on in these states that we've heard about this afternoon, what kinds of things stand out to you?
I think we're definitely seeing, like you said, the gas tax is still important, but there are folks looking at a lot of different revenue sources. It's not just one size fits all, and like I said, I think we're going to see quite a bit of activity, and many of these states that have not raised any of their rates, as time goes on and you don't adjust things for project costs or inflation, that real purchasing power declines. And in many of these areas where you're going to have growing populations and a growing economy, more freight shipments, you really the states are really having to step up to meet some of that need.
So are we seeing states talk also about indexing of motor fuel taxes this year? That's something that we've seen in recent years, but are we seeing that this year?
We are seeing that. So of the 17 bills that we're tracking so far that have been introduced this year related to motor fuel taxes, 7 of those are just a straight gas tax increase, but another 5 do include some sort of indexing measure. And, you know, we didn't see as much of that last year in some of the bills that were introduced, but I think that's still, states are still trying to do that where they can, recognizing that, you know, that purchasing power over time really is important if you want to keep your program whole.
And then are we hearing about any plans to sort of diversify the revenue stream for transportation in any states? You know, some of the more interesting ones that we've seen in recent years, Georgia has that hotel-motel fee that goes to transportation, and I know Massachusetts did a couple of things, a couple of which had to later be repealed. But do you think we'll see more sort of unusual sources for transportation revenues emerge, and is there anything new under the sun in that regard?
Yeah, I do think we'll continue to start, you know, continue to see some of that where it can get passed, but there still is that link with user fee revenues that I think a lot of states like to preserve. But we have seen that increase in the one-time funding, especially last year, and I think in some cases that can actually hurt efforts when you're trying to get some sort of recurring revenue increase, and perhaps if you have a surplus in your budget that year, you know, we have heard cases where legislators say, well, we'll just put some money towards it this time, part of our surplus. You know, it's not a reoccurring revenue. But I think what they did in Georgia, and especially their indexing with the CAFE standards, was something new that we haven't seen before. So I think it depends on the politics and what kind of deal you can get passed at the state level.
I mentioned that you know, some in Colorado want to look at a sales tax to increase transportation revenues. We've obviously seen the self-help counties in California approve sales tax ballot measures to fund transit in recent years. Are sales taxes a worthwhile route to go for transportation funding? And you know, what about other types of taxes, property and income taxes and these kinds of things?
It does depend on the state. You know, Florida has a little bit more of a diversified revenue stream with some property-related taxes. It's still, for most states, again, they like to preserve that user link. So most of the time, we see the sales taxes at the local level. You know, there are not many county governments or local areas that have their own gas tax. So a lot of times, that's where we see the property taxes and the sales taxes come into play. But certainly in California, when you look at the self-help counties, they have completely transformed the market in California over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, well over half the work that goes on in California now is from some of these major initiatives, and that part of the construction activity in the state from the self-help counties has been growing, while the Caltrans program, the state DOT program, has had some significant challenges and cuts over the last few years. So we definitely are seeing those local areas step up as well, especially in some of the larger metropolitan areas.
It looks like this year we're also seeing a number of states talking about tolling. What's the promise of, and what are the challenges of turning to tolling for various states?
Oh gosh, that can be a loaded question. I'd be curious to hear if any of the other panelists had experiences with some of those discussions. You know, it really does vary state to state, and you know, sometimes we do see a little bit of a pullback on tolling, but there's no question when you're looking at some of the major projects, you need that revenue stream, or else they're just not going to get done. So yeah, I think that's definitely one of the options that some states are looking to.
And what about tolling in the context of you know, we've heard that the Trump administration perhaps wants to do this $1 trillion infrastructure investment with some help from the private sector and trying to entice more private investment and that sort of thing. Obviously, in many of those P3 arrangements, you have to have a you know, the tolling to be able to make those kinds of projects work, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's the challenge with you know, what the current administration is talking about with the $1 trillion number that they've put out there. That is just private financing, which in some, again, urban areas where you do have a revenue stream, where you have a public that is willing to use that toll road, those projects could work, but that is not, I don't think that's going to be a substitute for any sort of funding through the traditional, you know, traditional federal aid program. And in many parts of the country, you know, those toll projects just aren't going to work, and they're not going to be the projects that are really needed in many areas to rebuild and reconstruct and repair some of the major interstates and commercial corridors. So while the price tag sounds great, there's a lot that has not been talked about in the details, and again, a lot of that private financing way of funding and the way of paying for projects isn't going to work in large parts of the country.
Yeah. You know, we saw, as you pointed out, we saw a number of very red states that have passed gas tax increases in recent years. There were 8 states that raised gas taxes in 2015, including places like Utah and South Dakota. Does that sort of hold any weight for other states that may be looking to do something, or is raising the gas tax and raising transportation revenues one of those sort of all politics is local kinds of issues?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to the local politics. You know, states, and as as the other panelists were talking about, they are forced to have a balanced budget, and that really drives a lot of these decisions that, you know, Congress just can't seem to make a similar decision at the national level for the federal aid program. But we do see states taking on this issue, and legislators and governors of both political parties. And I think that's important, and especially that momentum when your neighbors are raising their gas tax rates and they're going to invest in infrastructure and perhaps be more competitive for businesses looking to relocate to your area. I think that does play a part in some of the discussions that are going on in the state houses. And yeah, that's one reason as well we really wanted to do that research about folks getting reelected to office, because we continued to hear that from a number of state advocates, that was one excuse that a lot of folks would use for not being willing to look at an increase. We've also done the research where we've looked at ballot measures over the last decade and looking at counties, and depending on their voting records or their registration records, whether they leaned more Republican or Democrat, and we found that local areas of both political parties, voters were very willing to approve transportation local initiatives, and I think people can make that connection between what they need in their daily lives and the improvements that they see.
Yeah. It seems like in some of the states that are considering gas tax increases this year, that a number of them are talking about how to make those revenue neutral by lowering taxes elsewhere or trying to do those sorts of things. What do you think is behind that trend?
Well, I think that's probably depending on the philosophy, and I think in some cases, depending on, you know, trying to get the governor to sign a bill or getting it through a legislature, that might be an important piece of the bargain per se to get that passed. So I think that definitely reflects the politics of the state, and we do see that without question, and we saw that in New Jersey last year as well.
Right. And then finally, you know, back on this idea of the Trump administration possibly doing this $1 trillion infrastructure investment, if that is sort of the promise of that being out there, do you think that's likely to cause any states to sort of take a step back from their plans to try to raise their own revenues this year and sort of take a wait-and-see approach and at the federal level?
No, I think that most states, I would argue, and this is probably a little bit more anecdotal, I think really the last decade of short-term extensions and the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. for Congress to get something done is absolutely one thing that's contributing to what we're seeing states do. It's not the only factor, but that certainly doesn't help the situation. And I think the flip side of that is the promise of a bill. You know, we did have President Obama talk about infrastructure investment. Presidents have talked about this before, not quite at the same level that we've seen during the campaign and certainly the first few weeks of the administration. But I would guess that states are probably not counting on anything from Washington, D.C. until it actually happens. And the other challenge is that it really is Congress that's going to decide what happens in terms of approving a funding bill. But of course, I think the president's going to be instrumental in pushing Congress to get there. So I think states, again, the needs are so great. The purchasing power declines over time have really added up that while that may be part of the rhetoric going on, I would be surprised if states were really holding back for a wait-and-see approach for D.C. And the fact that the plan itself with the private financing isn't really going to meet many of the needs that most states have.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We are just about out of time for today's webinar, and I want to thank all of our guests, Alison Black, Caitlin Lang, Andy Lyman, and Gordon Friedman for joining us this afternoon. Here's how you can connect with us on Twitter. Thanks also to everyone who logged in to join us today. Be sure to check the CSG website for information about future eCademy webinars on transportation and other topics. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thanks again for joining.